All right, so we talked a little bit about methods in the previous lesson, and a method is just an operation that we can perform on an object or a library. And the series constructor method that we've been calling on the pandas library is just another method. Now, methods have something called parameters, and parameters take values called arguments. And before I dive into the technical explanation, I wanted to dive into a real-life example so you get a sense of how it translates to the code here. So if we think of something like a video game, think of the options or settings that we may have. We may have a difficulty setting that may be easy, medium, or hard. We may have a volume setting, which is going to be a number between 1 and 10. And we may have a subtitles option, which may be Boolean, true or false, on or off. So in programming terms, the option itself, for example, difficulty, is what's called the parameter. It's a setting that we can provide something to. The option that we actually select among our choices, so if we select easy, the option that we select, our choice, is called the argument. So in this case, easy is the argument that we're providing to the difficulty parameter. If I choose a volume of 8, for example, I can say that I'm providing an argument of 8 to the volume parameter. Similarly, if I choose true, you could say that I'm providing an argument of true to the subtitles parameter. So the parameter is kind of the name of the option, and the argument is the choice that we choose for that option. And methods in Python have parameters. They have options that we can use to modify how that method performs. It buys us flexibility and allows us to do a lot of different things. But in order to get the method to operate in the way that we want it to, we have to give the right arguments to those parameters, and especially in the right order. So let's begin by creating two Python lists. Let's create a fruits list, and it's just going to contain apple, orange, plum, grape, and blueberry. And right below, I'm going to create a list of weekdays. Let's do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And at this point, I'm just going to follow the typical syntax for creating a pandas series. So I'm just going to do pd.series, and I'm going to write my parentheses. But before I put any of my lists in there, what I'm going to do is hold my Shift key on my keyboard and press Tab. What that will do is bring up documentation right below my cell. In fact, you can keep holding Shift and press Tab 3 or 4 times to get this documentation to expand and be featured on the bottom of the screen. Right now, we're just showing a brief preview of it right below the cell. And we can see right here that within our series method, we have the parameters listed in order. So our first parameter here is data, followed by index, followed by dtype, followed by name, and so on. Each parameter here is split up by a comma. That's the separator of each. After each parameter, we have an equal sign and then a value. And what this value represents is the default argument. The default argument is what pandas will use if the user does not specifically give it an argument themselves. So for example, we can see that this index parameter takes a default argument of none. What that means is that if the user does not tell pandas what to use as the index, it's going to default to none, which means create the default numeric index that starts at 0. So when we've been writing in a list in the previous lessons, what it's doing is feeding that list as the argument to the very first parameter. You can see that the very first parameter of the series method is data. That is the data source that it's going to use. So even though we haven't written out the parameter name explicitly, we don't write data yet, whenever we write something like fruits in here, pandas is taking fruits right here and giving it as the argument to the data parameter. And that's how pandas knows to use that list when it generates a series. Similarly, if we were to replace this with the weekdays list, in this example, weekdays is the argument that's going to the data parameter. That's how pandas knows to use the weekdays list instead as the values within the series that's generated. So arguments, again, are just like the settings that we choose for our available options. Now, there's different ways that we can specify them. In this example, they're being fed sequentially. Because we're only giving one thing within those parentheses, and they're fed sequentially in order, Pandas is assuming that we're giving weekdays to the data parameter. But however, we can provide more than one argument by separating them with commas. So for example, if I would write fruits, comma, weekdays, and let's once again hold Shift and press Tab to take a look at our documentation. When I structure them sequentially like this, what Pandas is going to look at is fruits, which is first in line, and it's going to supply that argument to the data parameter. It's then going to look at weekdays, which is the list that's second in line, and it's going to give that list as the argument to the index parameter, which is the second in line. So it's just kind of feeding them along sequentially. So now that we've given fruits as our data and weekdays as our index, the values from the weekdays list are going to serve as the index values in the series that we generate. Let's take a look. And there we have it. The values from fruits are on the right as our series values, and the values from the weekdays list are now the index labels to the left. Now this is just one syntactical way that we can write in multiple arguments. We can feed them in sequentially. We can also write the parameter names out explicitly. So I can do something like pd.series and actually write out data equals fruits and index equals weekdays. Now the advantage of this way of doing it, there's actually a few benefits. The first is that you have a better sense of what the parameters are and what you're giving the arguments to. And the second benefit is that it actually allows you to skip sequential arguments. So in this example, we're doing them in the exact order that they appear. But if we wanted to give an argument to something like the fast path parameter, which is the sixth one in line, we don't have to give it sequentially. We can just write out the parameter names and kind of exclude the ones in the middle, and Pandas will understand what we're doing. So that's the big advantage of doing it with the explicit names written out. But we don't have to. The two options that we have here are identical. The syntax is different, but they both generate the exact same series. And there's one more way that's very common that I wanted to show you that's kind of a mix between these two ways, either feeding the arguments sequentially or writing the parameter names out explicitly. What's very common is to write the first argument sequentially, so to write something like fruits, and then write any subsequent parameters explicitly. So we're going to use fruits as our data argument, and we're not going to write data out, but writing index equals weekdays out and any other parameters as well. These, again, all three of these are the exact same thing. They produce the exact same series. They're just three different ways to do the same thing, and you might see this code from time to time in other people's Jupyter notebooks, so just as a heads up. So that's just an introduction to the parameters and arguments. And one other thing that I wanted to show you in this lesson is that index values, as I mentioned, do not have to be unique. So I'm actually going to copy these two lists from up here into the cell below. And now I'm going to give fruits an additional fruit. I'm going to give it the value watermelon, watermelon, watermelon. And I'm going to give another string to the weekdays list, and I'm going to make it another Monday. By the way, as you might predict, the length of the lists that we feed into data and index must be identical, or Pandas will not be able to match them and we'll run into an error. But in this case, we both have 6 values in each of those lists, so we'll be just fine. So once again, I'm going to do pd.series. Let's take a look at our documentation by writing those parentheses and holding Shift and pressing Tab. There we can see our parameters, which are like options for our method. We can see our first two parameters are data and index. I'm going to write the data parameter out explicitly and give it my fruits list as the argument or the value we select. The next parameter I want to use is index, so I'm going to write it out again, give it an equal sign, and write out the value or the argument that I want to give to the index parameter. That's going to be my weekdays. And now we're starting to see the differences between a Pandas series and a Python dictionary. The index labels in a Pandas series do not have to be unique. So here we have Monday represented more than once. Now, whenever you do have duplicates in the index, some data operations will not be possible. So that's just something to watch out for. But it's just really to demonstrate the flexibility of the Pandas series object. It's like a more robust list meets dictionary kind of thing. It gives you all of the functionality of the standard Python objects, but with a lot more ease of use. So that's just an introduction to parameters and arguments. Definitely not the end of this discussion. We'll keep diving into a lot of parameters and a lot of arguments, and as we practice more, you'll get a sense of how the two work together. But in the next lesson, we'll be importing our first CSV into the notebook, and we'll be using a brand new method to do that. So I'll see you there.